Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Tessa Devereaux. I lead the Africa cluster in the politics department here at SOAS. So welcome to this talk entitled Reclaiming Pluralism, Lessons from South Africa for a Divided Britain with Ebrahim Rasool. So this talk was organized with the help of the Islah Collective, the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, the Center for Pan-African Studies, and the Department of Politics. Our speaker this evening has had a fascinating and varied career driving forward the conversation between South Africa and the rest of the world. So Ambassador Rasool began his involvement in politics as an activist, taking a huge personal risk at the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle through his role in the African National Congress and the United Democratic Front. After the end of apartheid, his involvement in politics deepened, serving as Premier of the Western Cape, as Special Advisor to President Thabo Mbeki, and navigating the complexities of the global stage as Ambassador from South Africa to the US as well. Today, a respected scholar, an interfaith leader, and founder of the World for All Foundation, he continues to champion the importance of justice and the idea that diverse communities can live and flourish together in a more equitable world. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool to the stage.
Thank you very much for that warm and generous introduction. DVC Laura Hammond, the leaders of this prestigious university, the sponsoring organizations who got me here, like Islah, and the students and faculty of SOAS. This is an enormous privilege to be able to speak to you today. And it comes at a very important moment, I think, in the world today. I want to say that the critical issue that brings me to SOAS is that roughly 7 months ago, I had the great honor of being declared persona non grata by President Donald Trump while I was serving as South Africa's ambassador there. And it was at the hand of what I thought were fairly diplomatic analysis of what was at play in the USA, the idea that the USA was being driven by what I called a supremacist instinct, not only domestically, but in their foreign policy as well. Because there was no other way to explain the falsity of the charge against South Africa of fomenting a white genocide, of land confiscation of the white community, and the general oppression of the white community. What many people did not see at that point was the ironic symmetry between charging South Africa with a white genocide at the moment South Africa charged Israel with genocide. The ironic symmetry between charging South Africa with confiscating white land at the same time that South Africa went to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to charge Israel with the illegal occupation of Palestinian lands. And so that symmetry escaped everyone in terms of understanding this mindset that was making this unjustified, untrue charge. And there's just so much you can smile through, but at the point when you smile about such allegations too much, you give it a veracity and you give it a respectability and you give it a credibility that such charges don't deserve. It's also that those charges were not simply the rantings of a president, but they were followed by the cutting of all our HIV money that we have historically gotten and that we now face because of the withdrawal of that money that fought the HIV pandemic. We now have to confront the idea that we could be losing 137,000 lives because of that. And that we could have up to, in sub-Saharan Africa, 1 million new infections of HIV. So it wasn't an innocent ramble, a stream of consciousness. It had a punitive effect. And so the idea that we were punished for that was not a palatable one. And so it wasn't that the ambassador said something and then we were punished. It was in explaining to an audience what could be at work in making the charge and then punishing South Africa, even in the tariffs and the trade restrictions that were placed on us. I'm very happy that 7 months later, my own government is saying, when President Trump boycotts the G20, which is really an African G20, I think my own government is saying, you cannot appease this man. You cannot make him like you. You cannot, we don't have the resources to promise him a jet. We have 4 Nobel Peace Prize winners in South Africa, and he doesn't fit the bill for us to nominate him. We cannot promise him a Trump Tower in South Africa. So we can't appease this man. We tried to take 2 white golfers and a white billionaire into the White House to have them say to Mr. Trump, they are not so bad. But that appeasement didn't work either. And so our Minister of Foreign Affairs this week said on CNN, almost now echoing my words, saying, we think that there is a supremacist instinct at work. Otherwise, you can't explain what is going on. And so, what is this supremacist instinct that is re-emerging in the world today? Who is it targeting, or what is it targeting? You see, we revel in the mobility of capital. We can take out our phones and move money across the world at the push of a button. We love the mobility of goods. We can put in an order now, and tomorrow something will arrive at our door. That's the mobility of capital and goods. But the moment people exercise that mobility, the moment people move from the hunger spots of the world to where there's plenty, the moment people move because of engineered conflict and instability and wars, particularly in the Middle Eastern parts of the world, engineered wars, and they move to the places where there's peace, we don't know what to do with that mobility. And so what do we do in the face of that mobility? We have innovated a number of isms and phobias. If you're black and you move, racism increases. If you're Muslim and you move, Islamophobia is created. If you are Hispanic and you migrate, xenophobia is created. If the other is LGBT, homophobia is created. If the other is the gendered other, misogyny and sexism increases. And so we're dealing with a world that is fragmenting on the basis of the identities people carry, and as the way to deal with the mobility of people by othering them. And so what is targeted, therefore, is the very idea of diversity and coexistence. And as South Africans, we come from a world in which our diversity was the basis of the discrimination against us and was the antidote to coexistence. What is targeted today is pluralism, because there is not the acceptance of the identity of the other, not the attempt to integrate identities, and I'm not speaking about assimilation. I'm not speaking about an assimilation that says, come inside here, you are all British, leave your religion at the border. South Africa has found integration where there is mutual respect between the integrities. So my integrity as a Muslim is respected by the South Africans, and my Muslim community respects the integrity of the South African nation to be prosperous, to be safe, to be secure, and not subject to threats. But today, in the face of this creation of isms and phobias, we have the attempt at a reassertion of a dominant identity that is a throwback to the age of colonialism. A nostalgia for the days when we all knew our place. A nostalgia for the days when we knew who was the boss. But that world has escaped. And what is at stake is the idea of the equality of people and the equity between people. And yet, at this moment of enormous danger in the world, this moment pregnant with conflict in the world, a trade war, the cutting of all aid across the world, tariffs for everyone in the world, a bellicose president holding forth from the White House. In the face of all of that, I don't feel a sense of despair or discouragement. Although there's enough obvious reasons for us to feel fearful and unconfident and insecure in this world, especially if you are one of those targeted others. Because we've seen this movie before in South Africa. We've seen a movie in which, before our rapture, there was a deep rupture. The apartheid state in South Africa killed more people in the last 10 years of its existence than in the 40 years before that. They had more states of emergencies, more people detained and imprisoned, more people killed in the townships, more soldiers in the townships in the last few years than was the case in the decades before that. Because we had reduced them to the last of their arsenal of weapons, which was repression. They had lost moral authority in the world. Their civilizational veneer was stripped of them. And they could no longer even keep an economy going to buy themselves out of trouble. And so reduced to absolute might, in which might makes right, or to use the currency today, peace through strength, which is another way of saying we are going to have to assert our strength over the world, because we can't assert our morals over the world, our ethics over the world, our civilization, because that veneer has gone. And so the last kicks of this dying horse is often more powerful than everything before that. And so that's the reason that we are not despairing. And in a young audience at SOAS, this is the moment that is made for you. Bertolt Brecht, in his play Galileo, puts into the mouth of Galileo the wonderful words where he says, "Unhappy is the land that needs a hero." Unhappy is the land that needs a hero. Our general state of danger and unhappiness and despair and bewilderment and sometimes intimidation that we feel is made for a new generation of heroes and heroines to emerge. This is the moment not to be fearful, but the moment to stand up and rise and to say, what do I do in the face of this? How do I accelerate the rupture so that we can move to some form of rapture? And so, for me, the call for heroism comes from the fact that we see 3 attempted massacres, for example, in Palestine. The first one, the massacre of people, the genocide, the attempt to kill a genealogy. It's a genealogy that is killed, and this, believe me, we are not the definers of a genocide. That was the group of survivors of Jews who managed to get out of Auschwitz and the Holocaust. And they came back and they said, never again. And they said, these are the signs of a genocide. When they try to kill your history, obliterate your heritage, that is to ensure that you did not exist before. You have no claim historically to the land or to your existence. When they kill the current generation of their genealogy, 60,000 people, it is an attempt to decimate a genealogy. And when they then target mothers, pregnant women, and babies and starve them, it is an attempt to kill the future of that genealogy. So we have seen the genocide. Secondly, we are also seeing what I call the patricide. The patricide is the killing of the very idea of a Palestinian state, whether in ideational terms or in practical terms, to make sure that there will be one state from the river to the sea, but it will be a Swiss cheese, an Israeli state with Palestinian holes, like our homeland system in South Africa. But I feel very proud to stand here as a South African to say, we may not have succeeded in stopping the genocide. We don't know the future of whether the patricide, the killing of the state, will work. But we do know, and this is where heroism is demonstrated by the citizens of the world. But we do know when we launched the case against Israel in the ICJ, and we did not go there with hearts full of rage and hearts full of solidarity and over sympathy for the Palestinians. That's what the Israeli lawyers expected would happen, that we'll be so mealy-mouthed in our compassion and rage that we will mess up the case. But we sent our A-team, a diverse team, including Jews, including whites, and we sent them with a legal case that was unimpeachable. And we got the prima facie ruling in our favor. But the moment we produced our case, we killed the third massacre, the vericide, the killing of the truth. From that moment, the civilizational veneer of Israel disappeared. From that moment, even young Jews could say, not in my name. From that moment, in North America, the campus turned on the Capitol. In Europe, the public squares turned against the parliaments. And in the Middle East, the streets were in disquiet, worrying the palace. And that has shown that governments could be the focus of our attention, but governments are often the wheelbarrows of history. The citizens have to lift them, turn them, and push them in a direction. That's the story of the anti-apartheid struggle and its relationship with governments. We had the people of the United States on our side before we had the Congress on our side, before we had the White House on our side. They were all late arrivals at the burial grounds of apartheid. And so, in that lies my hope that the citizens have recoiled, that the citizens have raised their voices, governments have been forced to follow. And in that lies the recipe for your heroism. Never to feel that you are useless, that your voices are marginal, because the collection of voices have made possible what we now see as the pushback of the genocide. And so, what we need to salvage in this era is the kind of diversity and pluralism that I think is frightening the hell out of supremacists. That's what they fear more, that people who are different and diverse can actually work together for a common cause. And so our task is to make the world safe for difference and diversity, to assert the counterinstinctive and not to succumb to the siren song of you are different, you are better, you don't deserve to be with them. What we need to do is to make the world secure for the poor and the vulnerable. What we need to do is to make the world free of bullies and the pernicious. And we must defend democracy, human rights, and freedom. Because they'd want to reduce the democracy to an exercise of voting, and then we may well end up with an illiberal democracy. There's all the 5-year trappings of a vote, but driven by the kind of fear that produces the populists. And so this supremacist instinct is not an instinct that is happy to be confined to the White House or to the United States. It is a revolution in export. There is no other reason for why they embrace the Nigel Farages. There's no other reason that the Vice President of the US campaigns for Alternative für Deutschland before going to the Munich Security Forum. There's no other reason that Orban is the chosen invited, that Malay is given 40 billion, that Marine Le Pen is being defended while she's charged, that President Lula is told to free Bolsonaro from charges. This is an export of a supremacist, and it has to stop somewhere. And Brecht's idea that unhappy is the land that needs a hero, this is the call for young people to take up that historic space that our generations had to take up in South Africa, that Martin Luther King's generations had to take up in segregated America, and that many others have had to take up over many, many countries. And so the construction of this heroism is for each one of us to understand that we can be busy with our single issue or our single community, but it must be connected to the bigger picture of this supremacism and this inequality that is afoot. Because sometimes we get lost. No, I'm a feminist. As if that is not connected to the battle against supremacism and all the other bigotries that we have invented in this age of people's mobility. We must be able to hold on to our own identities, but we've got to insert those identities into broader coalitions in the same way that as a Muslim, I could join with Archbishop Tutu, that I could join with Joe Slovo and others in the United Democratic Front, and not make ideology the divider and the fragmenter, but to say, let's get to the lowest common agreement between us that apartheid is wrong and that we will oppose it. And so your identity must not be the barrier in making the kind of coalitions that I think we all need in this time. We must be focused on the bigotry against us, but to understand that the bigotry against us is part of the family of bigotries. If it's Islamophobia against me, it's racism against blacks. It's homophobia against the LGBT. It is xenophobia against the stranger. It is misogyny against the woman. And if we can't see that, and we make the contradictions between two identities the barrier, then we will not succeed and we will all succumb. And our desire sometimes for peace must be based on prioritizing justice. And so we need, as I end, in the way in which we confront this and we discover our heroism, we must do so not by mirroring our opponents, because you don't fight extremism with extremism, because that's the rabbit hole they want us to go down. They invite us to that rabbit hole in order to get us onto their terrain of strength, because we can't out-extreme them. We cannot imitate our opponents by becoming more violent than they become, because that's their terrain of strength. As Umar Mukhtar said to someone who asked him in Libya, shouldn't we kill their civilians like they kill our civilians? He said, they are not our teachers. So heroism comes not from imitating or mirroring. Heroism comes from being able to define what is your terrain of strength, what is their terrain of strength, and how do we pull them onto our terrain, which at this moment they fear the most. It is our ability to be the moral voice on the campuses. It's our ability to be the peaceful protesters. It's our ability to raise the warning bells of supremacism. It's our ability to speak out all the time and not to fall into the temptation of speaking an intemperate language that alienates the people who should be with us. And so I end with what was the rallying call of the Muslim organization that I joined, that affiliated as its first act to the liberation movement and the second act to Desmond Tutu's interfaith movement. We said that the call of Islam was radical, but not fundamentalist. The call of Islam was militant, but not violent. The call of Islam was revolutionary, but not extreme. And in the sharp dividing lines between those two, I think is the formula that we are invited to for our next act of heroism. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum, Ambassador Rasool.
Salam.
Welcome and thank you for being here. We're grateful for your time and I'm looking forward to a thoughtful and meaningful discussion. You've opened up a lot of powerful themes there. I want to begin by taking one step back and grounding us in something foundational. You grew up under a regime that engineered identity to divide people. From that lived experience, what does meaningful pluralism look like for you today, beyond diversity as a slogan?
So a diversity that is too easy must be questioned, because it's not challenging enough for you to take a step into the unknown, to truly put your life in the hands of someone who shares your objectives, but you may get some pushback from being in the relation. So the call of Islam had to really manage the Muslim community and educate the Muslim community, because we were in coalition with communists, nationalists, liberals, and everyone else. And so diversity must have enough frisson, must have enough pain for you to know that it is. Otherwise, you are in the conversation of the deaf, where you only with people who look like you, talk like you, eat like you, pray like you, dress like you, and walk like you. And so for me, that's the issue of diversity.
Thank you. I think that leads directly to something that I think many of us here are struggling with today. You've lived through a system that's weaponized identity. And even after the apartheid fell, the work was definitely not over. And when we look globally, we're seeing similar cycles, progress, and then regression. So when we look across the last century, we see societies that fought their way out of deeply anti-pluralistic systems. Apartheid in South Africa, Jim Crow in the US, Britain's colonial and racial hierarchies. And for a moment afterwards, it seemed as though genuine pluralism was finally taking hold. But today, we're watching a worrying reversal. The resurgence of Afrikaner nationalism in South Africa, a rise in the Christian national rhetoric in the US, and similar dynamics here in the UK. Given these parallels, what practical advice would you offer to young people in Britain to challenge these narratives before they harden into policies that materially harm our communities?
I think the first response to this growing populism, this growing supremacist instinct that is taking root in the world, is to insulate yourself from the siren song, because you too are subjected to your own siren songs of identity. You're a Muslim, you're different, don't get involved. You're a Christian, you don't share the heaven with someone else. You're a communist, you have a pure ideology that doesn't compromise with capitalism, etc., etc. So we all have these siren songs, and unless we divest ourselves of that, we cannot be real exponents of an anti-supremacist viewpoint. The second one is to not engage too much in that kind of rhetoric yourself, in pushing back. And so, in a sense, what we need to do is not succumb to the language of racism in fighting racism, because then we are indistinguishable. Just as I said at the end, you cannot engage extremism with extremism. You've got to find the antidote to that extremism, which is to invite people to the middle. You see, because the middle is the place where the discomfort is for the supremacist. That's the place where they encounter the other. That's the place they're afraid of, not because the other will attack them, but they're afraid of it because the other may get you to like them. That once the other, in the Quranic word, lita'arafu, once the other becomes known to you as a human being, you may not have the distance to just condemn them any longer from your platforms. The third thing in doing that is then to create the encounters with the others and to bring people in relationship to each other, because as Nelson Mandela taught us, that we have to, that people like ourselves have the responsibility both to ensure that we are not dehumanized, but we also have the responsibility to humanize the oppressor. And how we humanize the oppressor is, for example, never mind what temptation you have, to always make a distinction between, for example, Jew and Zionist. Because Judaism is a wonderfully rich, respected repository of ancient wisdom. And the moment we become sloppy in our language, and even if a Jewish person tells you, no, I'm a Zionist, I say to them, I insist on speaking to you as a Jew because I need to redeem Judaism and humanity. The moment I begin to fall into the trap of calling, and that's the logic of Nelson Mandela and the white community, to go out and redeem even the wife of the architect of apartheid, to invite his jailers to tea. It is to redeem the humanity of others. And we must never think that those are namby-pamby stuff that you don't have to do. It's what nonsense is this? It's sometimes the gesture that is absolutely crucial.
Definitely. Thank you for that. I think that brings me to a moment in your own diplomatic life that you mentioned in the beginning that really illustrates that tension. So you've spoken about how political backsliding isn't just a domestic issue. It shows up in foreign policy too. Your expulsion from Washington came as a result of Trump's aversion to your own criticism of his policies and a further intensification of the extreme nature of his rhetoric, where your own moral and diplomatic positions were well known. Coming from a country that emerged from apartheid and built its democracy on pluralism and reconciliation, how did you reflect on that moment? Being expelled from a nation that calls itself the land of the free? What did that juxtaposition reveal to you about the gap between a country's ideals and the political realities it's shaping diplomatic decisions? And I'd just like to add, some people may argue that your comments did not adhere to diplomatic norms for a serving ambassador. So what are your comments on that?
I think that in a timeline of my declaration as persona non grata, by that time, on his first night in office, President Trump had already proclaimed the withdrawal of aid from South Africa. By the 20th of February, he had written into an executive order the allegation that there was a white genocide. He had already written into that as a result of that, these are the punishments South Africa would face. Before we even got to that, the idea of an executive order inviting white South Africans who are unhappy and who are oppressed in South Africa to become refugees in South Africa was already happening, and the first tariffs were already placed on South Africa. Whatever the ambassador said had no effect on what was done. What the ambassador said, what I said in that case, was an explanation to our policymakers, an explanation to our intelligentsia about what was at the heart of all of this kind of things. And if I had followed the advice for orthodox diplomacy, then it would be a values-free diplomacy. Because as we learned from Nelson Mandela, any policy, including foreign policy, is like a telescope. It has two lenses, a lens of your values and a lens of your interest. In the case when Nigerian President Sani Abacha executed Ken Saro-Wiwa, Nelson Mandela went against the wisdom of the ANC to condemn Sani Abacha. And his response was, if we give up our values, who are we? And so the United States, on the other hand, turns that telescope around, keeps its interest against its eye, and then calibrates its values. And that's why it can give the Middle East a triple bypass of freedom, democracy, and human rights, as long as their interests are secured. And so that was the choice that faced me. If I had smiled through more allegations of a white genocide, if I had been silent throughout all of that, I would have ratified the allegation by President Trump. By that point, it was clear that there was no appeasing him. There was no way of getting him to like us. There was no way, even if you send in two Afrikaner golfers and an Afrikaner billionaire, that there was no way they were going to change their mind. Our president has discovered that now, and that is why, for the first time, they are adopting a language when he is imperiling the first African G20 meeting and trying to reduce it to nothing.
That's great. I think, and when we place that personal moment next to what's happening in Gaza today, the contrast becomes even sharper. It raises a much bigger question about moral authority and the limits of the international system. I think we've all seen that the last 2 years in Gaza has reinforced a well-known fact about the international system, the imbalance of power in the global political scene. The US and much of the West is able to operate outside of the established institutional checks and balances to prop up Israeli war crimes, while smaller nations such as South Africa have no choice but to utilize traditional legal and diplomatic challenges, which may have broad success in proving Israelis' guilt, but the lives of Palestinians have not changed as a result. Is there an element of institutional failure here? And for those who trust in institutions and the moral standings of most nations has completely eroded, how should they be expected to analyze these power imbalances? And how should they be expected to engage with institutions which have fallen short in their responsibilities to protect? And to add, how could countries across the globe be held to adhere to human right conventions in a more honest way?
The great disappointment of the boycott and the attempted sabotage of the G20 this coming weekend is that there was such hope from 4 successive years of global South leadership of the G20, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. The idea was that this was going to be the crescendo in which the demands of the global South could at last be heard and formulated. And so the demands for a balancing out of power in the IMF World Bank, in the credit rating system, because today Africa pays 9% interest on loans versus Europe paying 3% interests on loans, on debt restructuring, in which the LDC's bottom is falling out of the world least developed countries. This was the moment to try and push for the reform of the United Nations, especially its Security Council and the anachronism over which it governs. And so the disappointment is that that agenda is not achievable at this moment. And so the imbalances will remain. Is it an institutional failure? I think failure implies that there's all goodwill and there is all best efforts to make something work, but something went wrong. I think it is an inbuilt hypocrisy. They've invented the idea of US exceptionalism. One of the demands on me when I was in Washington by a senator was South Africa dismantled its nuclear weapons at the transition. We now sit with highly enriched uranium. The whole spiel about Iran having funded the ICJ case was to lead to another thing that was going to say South Africa could potentially hand over highly enriched uranium to aid Iran's nuclear ambitions. And the demand on me was, tell your government to hand over the highly enriched uranium to the United States. My reply was, we are a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. We cannot hand over our highly enriched uranium to a non-member of the Non-Proliferation Agreement, which is the United States. She said, no, but we are exceptional. I said, it's because you're exceptional that we cannot hand it over to you. You see, there's a lot of the pressures like that, like the demand to drop the ICJ case, like the demand to get out of BRICS. All of those were calls for South Africa to surrender. But the point is that we are not dealing with an institutional failure. We are dealing with a system that is hypocritically constructed. And so the only reason Israel is in the ICJ is because post-World War II, they were the main sponsors of the ICJ and the main drafters of the Genocide Convention. And that's why they're in it. But the United States and Israel are not in the ICC and other such important treaties, because then they're exceptional.
Thank you for that. And I think so, given this global landscape of both crisis and responsibility, I want to end by looking at what's emerging within Western democracies, especially through the rise of new minority leaders. So this year has shown that new political possibilities are emerging for minorities in the Western democracies. One example that's resonated globally amongst, I'm sure, a lot of us here is Mamdani's victory in New York. His campaigns have been incredibly inspirational for young people across the West, especially those from minority backgrounds. And given your experience in a country where political transformation required a complete upheaval of apartheid structures, I'm curious about the parallels you see. Do you think there are meaningful connections between South Africa's political journey and the political space Mamdani is beginning to carve out?
I think Mamdani ran a very clever campaign, but I think he had a compelling vision, which begins to tell me that there is an appetite for a different vision for the world. I think that we mustn't fall into the trap of reducing him to being clever on social media. He was. To being clever on Instagram and using that. He was. The point of the matter is it was an alternative vision in a fossilized world. You see, he is representing, in a sense, from the left, what Trump extremely did from the right. The United States, and maybe even Britain, is not divided so much between left and right, Democrat and Republican. It is an insurgent assault on incumbency. Incumbency is what is the problem, because it has all these issues of elitism, of social distance, of aloofness. And so you must remember that Trump's assault on incumbency started by ridding the Republicans of its incumbents, getting rid of the Reagan Democrats, getting rid of Bush and his dynasty, getting rid of Mitt Romney and all of those. And that was his major victory in Trump 101, that he had rid. And if you use classical, and I see Adam Abib is here, so I'm just showing that I'm clever. If you look at classical revolutionary theory, the pre-insurgency for Trump was the Tea Party. His incipient insurgency was Trump 101, in which he first annihilated the incumbency of the Republicans. His open insurgency happened when he lost, and January the 6th happened. And he is now in what he hopes will be the resolution phase of the insurgency, but the 2024 represented the defeat of democratic incumbents, which had never been more decrepitly portrayed as in Joe Biden's "I am a Zionist" kind of statement. And so there is this assault on incumbency by an extreme right-wing insurgency. And I think that what Mamdani does is to say to the Democrats, we need a form of urgency insurgency as we go forward. And so that, I think, is what is happening. That is what is the case. It's in South Africa. The ANC incumbency is under severe attack, rightly so, because it became complacent, because it became greedy, because it became unimaginative, and because it became overcautious and didn't act against what went wrong. And so it's laid the basis for that kind of insurgency in South Africa. It's, I think, is Nigel Farage your insurgent here against the incumbents of both the Labour and the Conservative and the Lib Dems and so forth? Or are we going to get a much more middle of the road insurgency that rings the bell of warning to incumbencies across the world?
Ambassador Rasool, thank you, and Jazakallah khair for sharing such grounded and principled insight for us today. Your reflections have reminded us that pluralism isn't passive. It's something we have to practice, protect, and build every day. For young people, especially in moments like this, your message is clear. Our political agency begins with how we show up for one another and how we refuse to normalize injustice. Thank you for challenging us and reminding us that the future is shaped by the choices we make now. Very much.
Well, thank you. That it?
Okay, so we have three questions. One has questions.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khair. Do you think there is a war evident between the supremacists and Russia, and what will be the implications? Because I can smell that. I don't know what you feel.
My theory, very simply, I'm not going to go into it, is that the holy grail in this economic epoch, this phase of the fourth industrial revolution, is critical minerals and rare earth elements. The assault on South Africa was intensified when South Africa lost 18 soldiers in the eastern DRC at the hands of the proxy. We joked in Washington that Rwanda had a great mineral export budget with the US without owning a mine. And so that. And the joke about, or the throwaway remark about annexing Greenland, there's a suspicion that there could be a silent agreement that when the ice melts and we help it to melt, there are enormous critical mineral and rare earth element riches that awaits us, and we don't need to fight about it. Let us see how we can share it, and we divide the world into hemispheres and spheres of influence, and we just make sure that that is what is going to work. Whether that leads to a collusion between Trump and Putin, I wouldn't want to think out loud. But that and therefore the litmus test is, will the Russian-Ukraine conflict be settled on the basis of the status quo ante, as it was in 2014, or will it be settled at the level of the status quo as is? Whoever has taken land now can keep the land. That is where we will draw the peace lines. And I think that all of those kind of things go into a very confusing mess, but I have no doubt that we should watch the space of critical minerals and rare earth elements. And it's very instructive that when Trump, in his domino fight with China, when he went from 125% tariffs to 250% tariffs, China said, no more, I'm just cutting all the supply of rare earth elements to you. And we saw last month Trump having to go to South Korea to get a year of reprieve from China on the export of rare earth elements, particularly the element of gallium that is critical to semiconductors and microchips.
Okay, so
Thank you for the talk. I have a question. As a diplomat, you spoke a lot, I think, about this idea of our solidarity with people around the world, no matter where they come from, what they look like, being consistent. How do you think then, in a diplomatic context, whether the threat on a people is coming from a Russia, from a Israel, from a US, from a government of Zimbabwe against its own people, how do governments and people in countries keep their solidarity consistent, especially in a foreign policy context?
So I think the foundation is the image that I raised about foreign policy being a telescope that you must most of the time keep the the lens of your values against your eye, and then you calibrate your interests, and not the other way around. And so on the basis of that, I think governments are often tempted to invert that telescope and to say, these are our interests, let us soften our values. And after that very famous episode of Nelson Mandela and Sani Abacha, I think we've had a few lapses in South Africa as people weighed up. Do we want to implode Zimbabwe? What is the best way to keep Zimbabwe afloat? And all of those kind of things. At the end of the day, we still had 3 million Zimbabweans in South Africa, and we have a continuation of a lot of the instability within Zimbabwe, and it didn't really solve all of that. But I do think that to a large extent, the Palestinians have given South Africa a way to be good again. That we all, everyone, whenever I meet Palestinians and people in solidarity with Palestine, they all come up to me and they say, thank you very much, South Africa, for what you have done, taking Israel to the ICJ. And I think we can absorb that thanks. But for me, the really important, because that act came at great costs to South Africa. There's a tire factory closing, Ford is cutting back on its workers, mines are in difficulty, and that's the tangible price of solidarity and doing the right thing. But what it does display is that, for example, the Palestinians have given us a gift that is greater than the gift we've given them. They've given us, after 15 or so years of corruption and of fragmentation and losing our way in South Africa, they've given us the ability to be good again and to recenter our morality. And so I think we need, in this era, to find that consistency that you speak about.
Assalamu alaikum. Considering that South Africa, although it's triumphed over apartheid and has taken significant steps towards an inclusive democracy, there's still significant inequalities, unemployment, poverty, and social divisions. Do you think that this is the fault of the ANC or of democracy as a whole?
I think it's a combination of factors, including some that you don't mention. I think that it's our inheritance from apartheid, where inequality is not just existing, but it's color-coded, where the inequality is meant to last into the future because you've got functionally unemployable people within a country like South Africa. That's one part of the story. The other part of the story is the nature of the settlement that we have made. Our transition in South Africa was a transition from apartheid to democracy within a global transition from a bipolar world to a unipolar world. And if you remember Nelson Mandela's first speech on the day he was released, he spoke about nationalizing the mines and nationalizing the farms and all of those, until we had to tell him, look, since the Berlin Wall fell, those things don't work as easily. We now have a unipolar world. The socialism is under enormous attack. And so we all had to rethink the very fundamental paradigms on which we had assumed the future to be based on. And so that was absolutely crucial, and we faultingly found our way to a mixed economy. We changed curricula a lot of the times as we discovered new things that we needed to teach and to learn, and so forth. And so we've probably harmed the kind of the kind of human resources requirements that we may have needed. I think we were meant to use the political beachhead that we gained out of the negotiations, and out of that fashion, a economic transition, bearing in mind and using Nelson Mandela's very important admonishment to us, don't destroy what you want to inherit. And so we didn't go for a scorched earth policy. And so it resulted in that 7% that is that we are told is facing a land grab from Black South Africans. They own 72% of the land. That same 7% that is so-called subject to a genocide own 90% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And so we've not been able to find the right kind of mechanisms, but they've been able to co-opt a few, to put a few, like the cappuccino, put a few sprinkles on top with a seething black mass at the bottom. And so that really is a second one that we've not thought through the trajectory of this transition. And at the moment, when we had saved quite a bit, ironically, from a gear policy, when we needed to make that second transition, we were suddenly faced with a corruption that was so rampant that I think the public infrastructure was completely denuded of resources, and we sat with energy blackouts. We sat with railway lines that, and again, it's a combination of objective realities that the infrastructure was aging. But for example, a simple thing, coal that must go to a power station to create electricity, a policy shift is made that we will get more black entrants into the economy if we move it not by rail, which we did all the time, but by road, by truck, because there are more black truck drivers. And suddenly, all kinds of moral hazard crept into it. The coal started disappearing, being mixed with. So there was elements of suicide, but there were also elements of murder coming from the past. And I think that the issue of corruption then did something. It let the white owners of the economy also off the hook, because they seemed to think that we were now confirming every stereotype they had about us.
Okay, so one.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the speech and for your time. From your South African experience, what do you really think truly comes next for Palestine? And when people speak about a peace deal, what do you believe that actually means in real terms? Is it justice, power, reconciliation, or entirely something else that we're seeing now in Gaza? And just briefly, I have another question as well. It's about student groups and student coalitions. For example, here in London or in the UK, what do you think are tangible steps that students should take in such a world?
On the first question on Palestine, I think that in a very ironic way, the world has been inspired to their better angels by the absolute suffering of the Palestinians under genocide. The outrage and the recoil has been fairly widespread and fairly universal in the sense that the backers of the genocide are on the back foot. What is missing, though, is the compelling vision and strategy by the Palestinians for what comes next. We can't impose that on the Palestinians. That strategy and vision must come from a modicum of unity. I often joke that Palestinians, when you meet them and they invite you to their struggle, they invite you to their faction. And they start by telling you how bad the other faction is. Despite all our diversity in our liberation movement, we agreed on 5 simple things: a united, non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, and free South Africa, and we went to the world and sold them that vision and proposition. And didn't confuse them about what the PAC says about the land. We didn't divide up what we didn't win yet. And so I was in a workshop with a group of Palestinians drawn from Fatah, from Hamas, and from civil society. And I said, I want to do an interesting, each one of you write down the 5 points that will constitute your vision for Palestine. And there was not a single one amongst the 10 who had the same overlapping visions. So what we need is Palestinian leadership about where we're going to next, based on a modicum of coherence, not necessarily unity, but enough coherence to tell the world, what do we do next? On the issue of students, I think students have been absolutely vital in this. I think that the point that I made earlier about not mirroring who you oppose and not imitating what you oppose as a methodology of struggle is often the one. So we don't want to curtail students by putting them in straitjackets, because it is that exuberance that the world requires students to bring and youth to bring. I was at the in Amman, and we went to the Ashabul Kahf, the cave of the 7 sleepers. And very interesting, in that chapter in the Quran, God shows that sometimes details and precision is not necessary when young people stand up for the truth. Because we don't know whether it was 3 people and a dog, 4 people and a dog, 7 people and a dog. How long were they there? Did they lay with their feet out? Whatever the case may be. So, but what we do know is what they stood for, the truth and the justice of what they stood for. And so we don't want to curtail it too much, but we also can't have a situation in which we allow a mirroring of the extreme that you oppose, because then you are just 2 extremists slugging it out. You've got to find a way to invite to the middle ground, because that's where the extremists are at their most uncomfortable. And that's the nature of student coalitions, of student action, of student protest, that you pull people to the middle ground as the point of encounter.
One last question, apologies. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for all the great points that you raised. So my question is about, you talked about heroism. So what kind of heroism is needed today? What kind of qualities are required? You talked about like giving hopes about the youth, how they need to stood up, but what kind this, struggle should be like?
Someone like Francesca Albanese, Sami Hamdi, the president of Colombia, and so forth. Heroism today, unfortunately or fortunately, is as simple as speaking up. And speaking with clarity and rising above the noise. You know, when we were in the struggle against apartheid and you spoke the truth, they jailed you, they killed you, or they exiled you. When a newspaper published the truth, they banned the newspaper or forced the editor to redact the truth out of the newspaper. When journalists investigated and wrote, they banned the journalist and the newspaper. And so that was the reaction of the forces of supremacism to truth. Today, they don't simply ban you. They don't ban the newspaper. But what they do is they flood the zone with lies. They create a cacophony of lies, of outrageous statements. They can hold forth for hours with a stream of consciousness, irrespective of the veracity of anything that they say. They flood the zone with lies in the hope that the truth will be flooded and buried. That's the tactic to mute the voices today. And therefore, an act of heroism is the act of speaking the truth. And the test of the truth is to speak it in the presence of a tyrant. And so that is it. But the sustainable truth is to build organizations. Not just tweet the truth, or like the truth, or share the truth. That's the easy part of it. It is to do all of that, but to understand that you can like something, but it doesn't mobilize. You have the illusion of 1,000 likes, but not 1,000 mobilizing. You can share, but you can't organize. What organization comes out of you pressing on that arrow for sharing? You can start WhatsApp groups, but WhatsApp groups don't defend the barriers, the barricades. And so there's just sometimes no substitute for good old guts. But I think it starts, heroism does start with now being able to proclaim the truth in a compelling way, because you've got to be more compelling than the flood of lies. And you've got to have the most imaginative way of telling the truth. And that's the problem with the middle ground. They're boring. It's the extremes that are exciting. They titillate you. The middle ground make you sleep in their sermons and make you sleep in their lectures, like I'm doing here, and so forth. So you've got to have a vivacity to the truth. It's not enough to tell the truth. You've got to animate the truth. You've got to use the full array of tools at your disposal to get that truth out. And you've got to make sure that the truth is so good that people will organize around it. That's it.
Okay, Ambassador Rasool, thank you so much for that. It was extremely insightful. I think as young people, you've given us a lot to think about, and hopefully we can implement some of these ideas that you've spoken about today. Thank you very much.